G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett, Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to our fortnightly poll position, where we give you the scoop on the latest results of the Guardian Essential Poll. I'd like to begin by acknowledging that I live and work on Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land. Sovereignty was never ceded, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. Days and times for our webinars do vary, so make sure you head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to find all our upcoming webinars. And just a few tips before we begin to help things run smoothly. If you hover over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A box where you can type in questions for our panel. You should also be able to upvote questions from other people and make comments. And please keep things civil and on topic in the chat. We'll boot you out if we have to, not that we have to do that very often. And finally, a reminder that this is a live event and it is being recorded. The video will be available later today at australiainstitute.tv, and the audio will go up as an episode of Guardian's Australian Politics podcast, so keep an ear out for that. I want to welcome our regular guests, Katharine Murphy, Political Editor of Guardian Australia, Pete Lewis, Executive Director of Essential Media, and his colleague John Remington, and welcome also, hopefully shortly, to Allan Behm, who is the head of the Australia Institute's International and Security Affairs program. We've got more than 1,400 people registered today, so thank you so much for joining us for Poll Position, because it's been another massive fortnight in politics, dominated by national security issues. Last week saw the Morrison government unleash a scare campaign, basically, around national security, forcing an unprecedented response, not one, but two heads of Azio, one current and one former, coming out to publicly reject the weaponization of national security for partisan purposes. We've got an escalating situation in the Ukraine. And in the last couple of days, the Australian government has alleged that the Chinese Navy aimed a laser at an RAAF aircraft. We've also seen a failed bid by billionaire Mike Cannon-Brookes to take over Australia's biggest polluter, AGL, and accelerate its path to net zero emissions and close down coal-fired power stations much earlier than planned. But while the Prime Minister's efforts to turn national security as the main centrepiece of the national debate has succeeded, it's one of the coalition's perceived strengths, but today's Guardian Essential Poll shows it may have backfired with the electorate. Katharine, I want to come to you first. The Morrison government really did a good job of turning the national debate to national security, but hasn't really been an edifying debate so far, has it?
No. The simple answer is no. It hasn't been an edifying debate, and you've set it up very well, Eb, as you always do. Yeah, it prompted not one but two former, one present and one former Azio chief to come out publicly and suggest to the government that politicising serious issues made Azio's job more difficult. And Dennis Richardson, the former Azio chief, said, in essence, the government was doing China's work for it by creating the sense of a partisan distinction that doesn't, at this point, exist in at a factual level. So, yeah, it sure was one hell of a week last week, but it was preceded by the Prime Minister failing to achieve his signature religious discrimination bill. I think the failure in week one actually was one of the reasons why there was this intensification and politicisation of national security in week two of Parliament. I think the two are linked. But then the poll, as you've said today, suggests that conventional wisdom, which says, that if the conversation is around national security, then the coalition wins politically, may not be valid at this point in time, which is really quite interesting.
We'll dive into the polling in just a tick, but Allan, I'm going to come to you next. We've just been kind of reflecting on the national security debate. How would you characterise it at the moment, and in particular, I guess, reflecting on Australia's relationship with China at the moment?
Well, the whole thing feels to me like an own goal on the part of the government, because so many of the messages which the government is putting out are deeply confusing. I mean, we're finding it difficult enough to land here on what it all means. And I think it's certainly the same for the electorate. So I think it's a pretty dangerous game that the government is actually playing. There are all sorts of sort of domestic communal repercussions from it. But in the world of public policy, I think most people just don't know what to make of it. Everybody knows that we have still a pretty close economic relationship with China, and yet day to day we have these sort of new problems that seem to creep into the relationship, making it difficult, I think, for all of us to understand what the devil's going on. So I don't think it's being played very cleverly, and I certainly, on the basis not only of our poll but of the Sydney Morning Herald poll this morning, don't know that it's going all that well for the government.
Pete, I want to come to you next. You've just written this all up as a column in The Guardian, if people want to head over to Guardian Australia to check that out. And I believe we'll try and post a link there in the chat. But you're basically writing that the China gambit is a bit of a Hail Mary from the PM. What's your take on it? You're on mute there, Pete.
That is the worst mistake to make in one of these. Sorry, people. I actually led off the column with the observation that the Prime Minister's dream of a khaki election has turned to caca, but that did not pass the Guardian taste police, probably for good reason. But I think the point still holds that this is an attempt to find a binary issue to polarise the community. And what our polling finds, we can go a bit deeper later, is that people don't see it as a binary about being tough on China or giving into China. It is complex. 2/3 of the Australian public see this as a complex issue. So my second point in the column, though, is a bit more broad. When national security scare campaigns have worked in federal elections, and they have not worked very often, 55 Menzies Reds under the bed when Petrov got expelled in the shadow of the election, but it was the height of the Cold War. And then 2001 when Howard ran on Stop the Boats, that was in the shadow of 9/11, cataclysmic global events that were politicised. I think it's lazy to say that the government can just win an election on national security. They've got to do two things. They've got to do an issue that actually hits people in their own life, either materially or at least emotionally. And secondly, they need to find links to the rest of the vibe of the community at the moment. So one more level of thought there. Where we've gone through this really long, hard period of pandemic, we're looking to move to the next phase, and just scaring us doesn't seem to be either A, an act of leadership, or B, particularly constructive. So I just think what we end up with out of this little week-long foray is more the Prime Minister iterating a scare campaign, trying to find a reason for people not to vote for Labor. I suspect he'll do what he always does and just move on to the next one now. And it's probably, I think we saw it at the start of this week, union bosses, here we come.
Yeah. Well, we might go to the polling results then, just checking that people can see that.
And for people that are listening on the pod, apologies last week, the slides were very confusing. So if you are listening on the pod, pause for a sec and go and download our website, essentialreport.com.au, and you'll be able to actually go into each of these issues and have a look at it while we talk about it. So we'll put that in the chat as well for people, but you can see it on the slides here. So,
yeah, but for people who are listening instead of watching, what we're talking about here is the best party to manage the relationship with China. And what do the results show here, Pete?
Well, it shows that Labor is actually seen as the better party. 28 coalition, 37 Labor, 34% unsure. And that's not what I don't think that's what the government would have expected. It wasn't what I was expecting either when it came back yesterday, but it just does show that this is not fertile ground. And whether that low rating is a context to last week's foray or a result of last week's forays, we're in the field, I think, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, while it was ongoing. But there, you know, if you say really good politics is call and response, there's not much response to the call here.
Yeah, Katharine, did that result shock you, given that everyone thinks it's home ground, safe turf for the coalition?
Well, yes, in a way, yes. But I think there's one sort of point of nuance, though, that we should add. Obviously, on this chart that we're looking at, Labor has a 9-point lead over the coalition in voter perception of the best party to manage the relationship with China. I think we shouldn't forget, though, that there are 34% in this on this chart. If you're looking at it, the numbers are 28 coalition, 34% unsure, 37 Labor. Right, 34% of respondents are unsure who the best party to manage the relationship with China is. And I think in part, the Prime Minister's motivation in sort of, kind of accelerating the big scare last week was to play into this knowledge gap that voters have about the Labor leader at the moment. Our poll over quite a long period of time suggests that there are a number of voters who just don't know what to make of Albanese. That it's not that they dislike him. It's just they don't really have a fix on him, right? Who is he? What's he about? Is he okay? Is he not okay? And I think that, in essence, in a political campaign, if the combatants don't define themselves, then their opponents define them. And I think that was in part what was motivating the Prime Minister last week. He wanted to sow this element of suspicion and doubt about Anthony Albanese, and national security was like a soundstage in which this little morality play was being projected to people, if that makes sense. So,
although ironically, I reckon it became more about him than Albo, as these numbers show.
Well, that's the intriguing thing, Pete, isn't it? And it's sort of like looping back to Labor's strategy too. I mean, now that we've sort of made this point that it's that uncertainty that the Prime Minister's playing into. Who is Anthony Albanese? Is he a safe choice, right? Is he a safe change in terms of government? So, that's the area. But I wonder too, in terms of with returning to the 9-point lead that Labor has, Labor is considered the better party to manage a complex relationship with China. Whether or not Labor's efforts, I guess, over the last 6 months in particular to paint the Prime Minister as somebody who stretches the truth, who tells absolute porkies, who, acts sort of ruthlessly and politically in his own best interests. So there was a Labor campaign. There's what various people have said about Morrison. Whether or not that's allowing people to discount what the Prime Minister is saying more forcefully than they would have been had that view of Morrison not been sort of put out there.
So Labor's successfully introduced an element of doubt when it comes to credibility, because we're really relying on Morrison's reputation here as the main seller of this this narrative.
And when you go into the Morrison attributes, as we will, they're in free fall. They really are in free fall. But,
all right, but coming now to Australia's relationship with China, you've asked people, Pete, what's their closest view about Australia's relationship with China? We can see 61% say Australia's relationship with China is a complex relationship to be managed. 26%, or roughly a quarter, Australia's relationship is a threat to be confronted, and about 13% who are looking at it as a positive opportunity. Is that a new question or one that you've asked before?
No, we've tracked it over a number of years, and my colleague John Remington might come in a second, let us know how that's tracked over time. But it does speak to that initial observation I made that this is not a binary proposition. The complexity of the relationship speaks to business opportunities, trade opportunities, Chinese, Australian, migrants and second and third generations. It's worth noting that this sort of narrow cast of the Red Terror, I'm not sure how that plays in seats like Banks and Reid and Chisholm in Melbourne, where Labor is putting up strong Asian Australian candidates. I think there is risk all round in this, and this shows that the Australian public is more mature and less gullible than elements of the press gallery, who almost had a Pavlovian response to Morrison's scare, that because he'd managed to pull off a miracle in 2019, of course he's going to come up with something again. And I thought the seriousness of which the analysis took what was really, a spitfire attack was also I think, telling in the way this election will probably play out over the next few months.
Alan, I want to come to you next. Obviously, 60% of Australians are pretty accurate there. It is a complicated relationship. It's an enormous trade partner, huge historical links between both countries. But where are we at in the debate at the moment, and where do you see things headed as we get to the election, particularly when it comes to that relationship with China?
Look, I think Peter has put his finger right on it. The government is playing to that 26%. It's not playing to the other two groups. I mean, I personally would probably fall into that 67% group. While I think there's a lot of opportunity perhaps in our relationship with China, at the moment we have to manage it. And I think that out there more broadly, that is what most people are thinking. As I say, all I can do really is just amplify what Peter's just said, because for some time now, including on the work we did last year, our own poll on Taiwan, people are stepping back from the hysteria that this issue is being presented in and thinking, well, actually, it's much more complicated than that, and we've got to work to get it right. And I suspect this is where the government is actually making a pretty serious mistake.
Thanks, Alan. Just coming back here. Oh, God, it's taking me back to the beginning. Sorry. There we go.
We're smooth today, Ebony.
I know, totally professional. Coming now to the tensions between Russia and Ukraine. Pete, can you walk us through these results?
Look, they're spectrum results, aren't they? So it's kind of, people are concerned about it. They're not saying, more than a quarter of them saying they're extremely concerned. You can't not be concerned when you see something like this occurring. I guess my question again will be, I don't think they're numbers that you build a khaki election around. And I don't see anything out of the normal in the spectrum of views we get when there are global events going on here.
Katharine, what were your thoughts when looking at these results? So obviously the Ukraine's much further away than any tensions with China.
Yeah, well, it's not a regional conflict, but obviously the spectre of a war in Europe, is going to, is just a terrifying prospect, and people locally will see it as such, I suspect, but that's got a way to play out. Obviously, we've had an escalation today, and I guess we've just got to see how this pans out over the coming days and weeks in terms of the international community's response, and then how that bounces back into the political contest. I was talking a minute, or referenced a soundstage a minute ago. It plays on the soundstage. It's definitely there in the background, but as Pete says, it's not sort of there forcefully as it would be if it was, I suppose, a risk right on our doorstep. But it is there in the soundstage.
But also, Katharine, as it plays out, I reckon this reinforces that on national security, it is largely bipartisan. So it's not as if you're going to have Labor departing from the coalition. They're not going to be calling to send troops in, or for that matter, waving Putin through. So this is really complex diplomacy. I think Australia is part of the Western consensus on how this is managed, and it will just be living proof that there isn't a huge difference between the major parties when it comes to issues like these.
I want to move on now to the approval of Scott Morrison and Anthony Albanese. Any big changes here that we can see?
Yeah, this is the first time that Morrison's been in net negative, and the first time Albo's been in net positive since the bushfires. First time net positive ever for Albo. So 49-44, as you can see, down to up 3 in the disapprovals for our glorious Prime Minister, and
coming to Albo
for the man from Marrickville, 39% disapproval, 42 approval. Still 20 don't know. There's only 7 that don't have a view of Morrison now. That's pretty baked in. But if you're an opposition leader, your 2 enemies are the don't knows, because that's an unknown how they're going to break in the end, and the sense that you're always going to be marked higher in the disapproval because your job is to play negative, and people don't like seeing negative. But you look at those numbers and line them up with Abbott before 2013, and he's in much better shape.
And coming to the leadership attributes here, walk us through this.
So we've only done the 6 months. So I put the 12-month up on my Guardian. And again, if people want to go into the website, essentialreport.com.au, and look at the leadership attributes, they'll see that things have been dropping pretty heavily. The big change in the last 6 months is down 13% on being in control of the team, down 8% in being trustworthy, down 8% in more honest than most politicians. But I've got to tell you, 12 months ago, it's even more stark. All those drops are double digit. As for understanding the issues facing women, go surprised, but only a third would tick that box. We haven't asked that before, so there's nothing to compare them with.
John Remington, I wanted to throw to you here. Were there any details drilling down in leadership attributes here? Like, are there differences between men and women or in age groups or anything that kind of stuck out?
Yeah, there were some stark ones as well. Rather differences, we also look at trends, particularly when we're talking about age groups. We tend to look at a younger cohort, 18 to 34, middle, 35 to 54, and 55 and above, and that's around a third of the population in each of those groups. And yes, old people have a lot higher opinion of Scott Morrison in terms of those positive attributes we've got on the screen there. So good in a crisis, in control of their team, and trustworthy. Younger people have a lower positive opinion, and with the mid-age group in the middle. And then in terms of gender, yes, males have a more positive perception, or more likely to say they have positive perceptions of Morrison, where women are less likely. So when you come to Albanese, which is on the next screen, in terms of the ages, that's flipped somewhat. So younger people have a more positive view of Albanese than older people, but there is little difference in the gender differences.
This is starting, though, to line up with, in terms of the character contest, it's not a weak spot for the opposition leader. So again, think about in the context of what was going on last week. The incumbent was trying to destroy his opponent by dragging his character down. But what these numbers say is that it's the incumbent whose character is in the toilet, and the opposition leader's traveling okay. Still lots of don't knows, but these are as positive numbers as I've seen for the opposition leader over this political cycle. And
just quickly moving on to voting intention here.
Which we never talk about except at election time. So look, we had it. I know a lot of people that were listening to the podcast, at least, and probably some of you in the room, were pretty depressed with our discussion last week because we weren't 56-44 like news poll. We don't go into that silly game because we have our don't knows involved, but we've got Labor 49, Coalition 45, 6% undecided in the 2PP plus, our roll gold indicator of where the votes are going, and a primary vote for Labor of 38, primary vote for the Coalition of 35 when before you distribute that last 6% of don't know. So I'm not even going to give you a make-believe 2PP that adds up to 100 because we don't believe in that, but it's not too bad, folks. But again, it's not a scoreboard. This is, and the other insight is it's not a horse race. This is actually a contest between an incumbent and a challenger with very different challenges and very different rules.
Yeah, I might come back a little before we get to the chat and the questions from the audience back to the relationship with China and events unfolding in the Ukraine. But Katharine, I wanted to come to you just about the Mike Cannon-Brookes bid in particular and what that says about our energy market and how we think that might play out in the election. It was a bid that was rejected, obviously, but it sounds like they're just back to the drawing board to come up with something that's more appealing to AGL. But I was just really struck, I guess, by the difference between the state level of government and the federal level of government, with, I guess, how much to panic about bids like this and the early closure of Araring, and also quite different from the head of AEMO, for example, as well, saying something I think that quite different as well. You're a long-term participant in that policy war. How do you think that's played out?
Yeah, it's really interesting. It's a really, really interesting move. Mike Cannon-Brookes has sort of been hovering around the energy debate and has sort of gradually put his toe a little bit deeper and then a little bit deeper into the whole mess of the energy market. And this is obviously a very big play, and he is framing it as potentially the biggest decarbonisation project in the world, if you can basically take those emissions out of the atmosphere in a more expedited time frame than AGL had been working towards. Obviously, AGL thinks the price is too low, so these guys will regroup. And obviously, it's not just Mike Cannon-Brookes. There's a major Canadian outfit, Brookfield, also part of this consortium. So it's very, very interesting. It's sort of kind of in one sort of flourish, sort of identifies the fact that we've been stuck in this never-ending debate about energy market rules and climate policy for a decade, and governments sort of warring about ridiculous things, and then it sort of exemplifies this phenomenon that the market is coming in over the top of the Australian government's inability to resolve an issue that's actually very important. So
yeah, I was really struck, Katharine. You talked there about how Mike Cannon-Brookes was talking about it as kind of a globally significant emissions reduction project, and it really just kind of shook me out of, I guess, the little narrow box that we've put climate policy in Australia. I just it made me feel quite hopeful about decarbonisation.
Yeah, hang on, Eb. Hang on. We have no hope. There's no hope on this podcast. There's no hope on this show. Just take a step back. Take a step back from the hope. No. I'm joking, of course. No, it's very interesting and significant. Obviously, it's got a long way to run because
you've got to be able to buy it first.
Well, in order to buy something, you've got to have a willing seller, and then there will be regulatory hurdles for the transaction to walk through because there is a Canadian interest involved. Just an interesting thought to put out there in the event that there was a FIRB issue with this acquisition, in the event that it's rolling, in the event that it doesn't all fall by the wayside. If there was a FIRB issue, I just think a really intriguing question is whether or not a major Australian industry superannuation fund might seek to partner with Mike Cannon-Brookes on this acquisition. Because look, in sort of like the fundamentals, I don't want to preoccupy us too much on this, but you've got me on my obsession, Eb, so just give me 2 secs here. There's a lot of things going on at once here. It's kind of like these mega trends, obviously, that there's a lot of pension funds around looking for assets and investment in assets. This energy transition is going to be enormously costly. It's going to be very beneficial also, but it's also, we're running through a period where big dollars are required to drive the change. And Mike Cannon-Brookes is talking about a $20 billion, that's with a B, $20 billion investment in terms of replacing these coal assets. So that's all happening. And we've also got, in terms of the pricing issue, the toing and froing with AGL, one of the really fascinating things for me is that this is like a live action session about the value of stranded assets. And if I'm speaking double Dutch, what I mean by that is coal generators, have a finite life. We're already in that world where coal generators have a finite life because of climate policy and because of the shifting cost curve with renewables. So one of the really fascinating elements of this is how much value can a company put on its stranded assets? And that's what we're going to see, this dialogue backwards and forwards between the consortium and AGL. But anyway, sorry, that's a big nerd dive, but
No, we like nerddom around here. I can see we've got about 850 people on the line with us today. Thanks so much for joining us for Pole Position with the Australia Institute, Guardian Australia and Essential Media. And if you are interested and nerdy about energy and electricity and climate policy, we've got another webinar this Thursday with Saul Griffith. His new book, The Big Switch, is about electrifying everything and saving households big money doing it. Again, another hopeful webinar about climate, if that's your type of thing. That's on Thursday. You can head on over to australiainstitute.org.au to find the details for that at 2 p.m. I'm going to come now to questions from the audience, and then Pete, we might come back a little bit later to finish up on those final slides. But I did just want to come back to, I've got a question here from Jonathan Nolan about the Ukraine, and Allan, I might direct this one to you in the first instance. It says the government is already trying to use the Ukraine conflict to buff up its security and defence credentials. In what other ways do you think it might increase this strategy, and do you think it will be effective?
Well, starting with Ukraine, Eb, I don't think that we have got much leverage with respect to the Ukraine at all. I thought that the numbers that Peter's poll indicated is essentially that the Australian community is concerned about it, as we should all be, but they don't know what to make of it. And interestingly, I'm not sure that anybody knows what to make of it. The reporting, I think, in Europe and North America is tending towards the shrill. We've been told for a month now that every day an invasion by the Soviet Union is imminent, but certainly looking at the force levels that the Russians have got on the border, I can't see that there's enough force for an invasion, frankly. There's certainly enough force to get everybody scared. And I think that's the game. I think what Putin is trying to do is unbalance the United States and unbalance NATO. And to this point, I think he's been quite successful. So you don't respond to that kind of pressure by being shrill. You respond to it by being smart. And that, I think, is where Macron and the German Chancellor Stolz are showing themselves to be on a rather different track. Macron is trying to exercise a high level of active diplomacy. Stolz is playing very, very quiet. And until those two parties have got a very clear joint position in Europe, I think it remains more or less as Putin wants it to be. And that's what concerns me, not the threat of invasion.
Katharine, the question was kind of, about, this working for the government in terms of making it a national security election. The polling didn't really bear that out. Do you have any other comments to add on that?
Only just that there's just that issue of uncertainty. It's not really, it doesn't, I agree substantially with what Allan said in terms of the diagnostic of the thing. It's possibly more likely to be in some sort of war of attrition than a full-scale disaster, she says, touching all the wood everywhere. But it's a bit too soon. It's a bit too soon to make predictions about that. How it bounces back locally. Well, again, it feeds into a sound stage. But I think what we're going to learn really with more data over the coming months, pulling all of that story together again, is whether or not the Prime Minister is a trusted broker of an uncertainty message, if that makes sense, right? He's the one saying you can't risk a change of government at the moment because there are all of these dynamics in the world that are deeply, deeply scary, and only we do scary things, not that pack of communists. So it's like, is he going to be believed on that message? Well, the initial data in today's poll suggests not.
Sorry,
there's kind of a cognitive dissonance. If you're saying I'm a safe pair of hands who takes responsibility and deals with the big crisis, but you're being defined as someone who doesn't hold a hose and doesn't think it's a race, then you're not exactly playing to your strengths. I think he needs to decide what his strengths are and then go out and campaign on that, but that will be interesting.
Thank you. I can see a lot of questions from blokes rising to the top here. So can I ask if you're on the line and watching the Q&A, if there's any good questions from women, or if you're a woman with a burning question, can you get it in the Q&A section there? The next one is from Jay Wilson, and Pete and John, this one's for you. They're asking if you've done any polling around the Climate 200 and how the independents are travelling.
Yeah, I might start it off, and then John, you can add anything you want. It's hard for us because we do a national poll of 1,000. So there are two difficulties. One is that small numbers of votes nationally, and we don't do the targeted seats. So short answer, no. Although, John, is there anything coming up in the independent vote that isn't connected to a UAP or One Nation?
Yeah, we do separate the independents out from UAP and One Nation, and kind of the effect of the advertising that Clyde Palmer and UAP have been done in recent months is reflected in those results. But as Pete said, independents do vary, and there's a huge range of where independents sit in different seats. So no, unfortunately, with the sample that we do and in this poll, we aren't able to show in how the individual independents are tracking.
No
That
worries.
said, I think the success of the independents is going to be a product of whether there is a wave for change. If there's a wave for change, I think they can surf it. There's nothing that we're seeing in our small samples to say that, it's not like you're seeing double digit, but I think in some seats, that's what you will get.
The next question is from Ronald Smith. He's more or less asking about still our relationship with China and the coalition managing that, basically making the point that it was under a coalition government that the port of Darwin was sold to Chinese interests for a period of 99 years. Katharine, I just wanted to come back. To me, it was quite extraordinary to see Azio, the heads of Azio, come out and do public interviews last week and really pointed to something going wrong. What are your reflections on how that all unfolded last week?
Well, it is extraordinary, and not in a hyperbolic sense, like in a demonstrable sense. It is extraordinary for the current head of Azio to step out twice in the space of a week. It wasn't just once, it was twice, to say in very, very polite terms, please, chaps, this is serious. Our job is to try and manage these really difficult, pressures, and you are not making it easier for us. I genuinely have to scratch my head to think about the last time that happened. Now, Azio's obviously has in the not too distant past sort of had a light skirmish on that front, just when things have gotten too hot. Azio has asserted its independence, but what happened last week was extraordinary. And also Dennis Richardson, the former Azio chief, went further, obviously, than Mike Burgess in terms of making an accusation that the coalition were basically inventing a partisan difference that didn't exist, and that was a demonstration of the government doing China's work for them. Quite extraordinary. Again, Dennis Richardson is a public servant who is one of those old school public servants. Allan will smile. Canberra mandarins of the old school, served all sides of politics, was appointed by John Howard to run Azio, and has also been an Australian ambassador in Washington, as well as the head of the Defence and Foreign Affairs departments. He's a significant figure.
Not given to, panics or an attack of the vapors.
No, exactly. Dennis just doesn't grab the microphone, run out there every old day. It's like he obviously felt very... he felt compelled to make an intervention at a certain point when things seemed to be running off the rails in a major way. So, and look, the questioner is right to say that and it goes back to the complexity of the relationship, which sort of goes back to the poll question. That these things are complicated, guys. And in terms of the history of Australia-China relations over the last 20 years, You know, there are a bunch of people present in the Australian political system who, you know, were great advocates of closer relations with China, you know, not 5 minutes ago. Now, I mean, what's changed? Well, the simple answer to that is China has changed. You know, there is an authoritarian regime in Beijing. You know, they're sticking their elbows out. They're destabilizing the world order in the way that, you know, Putin is currently trying to destabilize NATO in the other hemisphere, right? These are serious times. This isn't all confected nonsense. There are threats. We are, as the Prime Minister correctly says, we are in the most dangerous geopolitical environment since the end of the Second World War. So,
but the interesting thing, I reckon, Katharine, is that it is so serious that people don't want it to be politicised. And
exactly.
You're right, this isn't make-believe stuff. Australia pushed back on Huawei getting access to our 5G network for good reason. We're concerned about Chinese money in Australian politics, which was kind of on the high grade tap once they stopped developer donations for good reason.
Yeah.
The scrutiny of politicians that are compromised by China is welcome. It is just that it is not, there is nothing that you can see in the national interest by turning that into a partisan battle, because it is so important to get right.
Yeah,
Allan,
well, that's
you've
simple.
been sorry, Allan, you've been around for a long time in these circles. Have you seen two heads of Azio come out in the space of a week like that publicly before?
Ebony, to use that unprecedented word, it's unprecedented. I've not seen this before. I'll just make two quick observations, though. The Director General of Azio did come out and make his threat assessment speech in the lead up to this. And I don't know that played into it all that much, but he was talking in what are fairly heightened circumstances, so that I don't think he had any option whatsoever but to come out and say what he said. And I thought he actually said it very well. That Azio, for its legitimacy, its credibility and its authority, has to be seen as totally apolitical. Otherwise, it loses the confidence of the minority communities, not least of all. And I think that what he did was, in fact, a good contribution to hosing the problems down, hosing the hysteria down. And he was pretty ably supported by Dennis Richardson, I think. So I just hope it goes away.
Yes, well, we can all live in hope on that front, Allan, but I'm not sure.
I'm with you. I'm with you and Katharine on the hopes thing. What else have I got?
The next question that I've got here, and I've lost it now, there we go, is from Mel Smith. She asks the panel, any wildcards to look out for in this election, i.e. an independent winning a seat, or maybe the rise of a Green in some states or something like that. Katharine, looking at the whole, you know, election thing, we still don't have a bunch of Liberal candidates even pre-selected in some states, but do you have any tips for some potential wildcards to look out for there?
Well, not so much wildcards, because I think notwithstanding the New South Wales Liberal Party's inability to pre-select candidates in the state that will likely determine the outcome of the next election, #go figure. Apart from that, I think one thing that we as a collective haven't really got into thinking substantially about yet in this election cycle is the Senate and the composition of the Senate. I think we're kind of people who are engaged in politics, and that'll be most people on this webinar and listening to the pod today. I think it's fair to say most people are engaged and will be across the sort of general national picture of teal independence, you know, a bunch of sort of actors on the right, from Clive Palmer through the Liberal Democrats and Pauline Hanson, of course, as well as the major parties and the Greens. I think people have a reasonable fix on that. But what we haven't really sort of got our minds around collectively is the Senate. And that is always very important, how that all spins out. So, you know, whether or not we end up with a minority parliament, whether we end up with a majority government, but the people in the lower house don't obviously have the numbers in the Senate, most, you know, very likely scenario. So, you know, does Clive Palmer to get back? Does Campbell Newman, enter the Senate? There's all kinds of interesting permutations.
The
there.
Adams family.
Well, it's just interesting. I don't know quite how that's, and I'm saying that not from a standpoint of knowledge. I'm saying that as a self-criticism. I haven't really got my head around it yet, but I think it's potentially a very interesting Senate at the end of this election.
Yeah, and I might just say that not to keep harping on other things that we're doing, but basically on Friday, the Senate does this, the Department of the Senate puts on a lecture series, and our Executive Director, Ben Oquist, and head of our Democracy and Accountability Program, Bill Brown, will be on this week. I think it's live at around 12:30 or 12:45 for that. It's totally free, just kind of a live stream that you can watch, but they'll be diving into the Senate in particular. Pete, did you have anything to add?
Oh, yeah, I'll give you my wild card because it was almost my column this week until the China numbers came through, but I've been wanting to get this out there, so you're as good as anyone. If you look at history, since World War II, government only changes in landslides. That if it is a close election, the incumbent holds on. Now, Allan is the only one that will call me out on that. Whitlam only picked up 8 seats in 72, but he picked up 26 in 69, the Don's Party election that got close to the shore, but not quite there. But since then, Fraser was 30, Hawke was 26, Howard was about the same, Rudd was in the 20s, even Abbott was 18. When it's a close election, incumbents, because they've got control of the resources, because there's no anti-corruption bodies, because they've got $16 billion in unaccounted spending, find a way of holding on. So if history is our guide, there is either going to be a wave election that Labor sweeps to power and Teal independents and others will come on the back, or there won't be a win at all. The least likely, history would tell you, the truly historic result would be to Labor to win narrowly. So I don't know quite what that means to this group, and I've got some other theories I'll throw out over the coming weeks, but it feels to me that this election is about creating the wave of change. The role of the leader is to get up on the board. Our job is to make sure they get into shore if you want to see a change of government.
Allan, anything to add? Oh, you're on mute.
After what Peter has said, there'd be a lot to add. The numbers at the moment indicate, to me at least, that a very narrow outcome or a hung parliament remains quite a strong possibility, given the levels of confusion. Some people would certainly hope that there'd be a very clear determination, but we don't know. And I just observed that Julia Gillard managed a very successful government on the back of crossbenchers. The Greens may be predictable, but Tony Windsor and Rob Oakeshott, she was certainly able to bring into an alignment with the government, which was to the advantage, actually, of the electorate and the people who voted. I think the Senate is critically important. And as Katharine said, where that's going to land will, I think, make it difficult, probably make it difficult for whoever wins. As for unpredictable things, I just want to reflect very briefly on the warship incident in the Arafura Sea. There's an aspect to that that does worry me a lot. It's not the Chinese warships going through the Arafura Sea. They had every right to do that. But it's the unusual thing of directing a laser at an aircraft. I think that is unusual, and if true, is quite worrying, because that kind of action can lead to catastrophic consequences. That's why pilots are very, very reluctant and report every time a laser is pointed at an aircraft. It can bring an aircraft down because the pilot goes blind. So something like that could just flip the whole thing around, and God only knows what happens. That sort of thing worries me.
Yeah, thanks for that cheery thought.
I hope it doesn't happen.
Yeah, me too. Katharine, we've got a couple of questions here that are just touching back on that Mike Cannon-Brookes offer to buy out AGL. One person, John Knox, commenting that the government seems dead set against the accelerated retirement of coal-fired power, and that did make me think about whether or not they'd use other mechanisms to try and stymie that kind of market behaviour. And I guess other people asking, is that a wedge for the coalition? Because it is the market working. Technically, the coalition should welcome market intervention, sorting things out like Angus Taylor asked them to do.
Well, it does put the government on the spot, but it does put it also does put all political actors on the spot, and you can see that in the sort of careful way that various actors have been circumnavigating these events. Obviously, you're quite right to observe that, you know, the so-called pro-market party, when it comes to energy, you know, sort of have the kind of, you know, have Soviet-style interventions, which is, you know, an ongoing matter of confoundment. You know, these sort of market interventions are supposed to substitute for a rational policy, and of course they don't. And this is why this bid coming over the top is so interesting. It's basically saying the market's chosen the direction, the market knows which way the cookie's crumbling, and rather than wait around for these clowns to sort themselves out, we'll just barrel in and get on with it. But it is complicated though for Labor in contests like the Hunter, because what an accelerated coal closure puts in the mind of voters again is this idea of just transition of workers being managed out of carbon intensive industries, which again sort of raises people's hackles and you know, promotes a conversation about work insecurity and all of that sort of stuff. So it's a bit tricky. It certainly has put the government, you know, sort of like, whoa, it sort of rabbits in the spotlight for sure. But the politics at the sort of narrow cast level are more complicated than the message at the national level, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and it did also just make me reflect, like you said, on that kind of putting the government on the spot. That's Araring closing early, not long after Liddell was closing early, and Hazelwood. You know, this is not the first. It's, you know, the fourth in a succession with more expected. It is something, you know, that I think people can see there's an obvious role for government to manage, particularly on the worker side of things here. And there's just kind of no even acknowledgement that this is an actual thing that's happening as we speak.
No. But this is the sort of amoral dimension of pretending that nothing has to change. Yeah. When obviously things change all the time, and will certainly change in terms of Australia's, you know, carbon intensive economy. Like it is already changing. Those changes will accelerate, because again, the dollars that drive these transitions, like two things drive transitions: policy and dollars. The dollars have made a call. The dollars know which way the transition's going, and these very, very big liquid players in the market will be looking for opportunities in order to basically, you know, invest in the new generation of long-term productive assets, right? That's what pension funds are looking for. So it's happening. You know, the coalition's failure to grapple with this, and not only failure to grapple with it, active attempts to basically circumvent, wind back action, pretend that things don't have to change, as I've said, over a long period of time, unconscionable. These are unconscionable actions. And they have, in fact, exposed workers in carbon intensive industries to harsher, quicker transitions than would have been the case had this, you know, had orderly action started a decade ago.
Yeah.
So,
I was really struck too. I know I said before, it made me hopeful, because I feel like we always hear that it can't be done. It's, you know, it's impossible. And I thought Mike Cannon-Brookes was like, no, I'm here. We can do it. We can make money out of it. I've got 20 billion over here to spend to build, you know, the capacity we need to replace it. It's all doable. Like, it was just very, I just feel like we don't even hear that side of things. Allan, you're a long-term person in climate as well. Did you have any reflections on that this week, that, you know, that the transition is happening and we're kind of caught on the hop?
I sure did. We worked very hard. I didn't want to burst into profanity there, but we worked very, very hard to land the Clean Energy Future package through both houses under Gillard. And that contained a really good map for the future, which was immediately trashed when Abbott was elected. And we're now paying a very high price, I think, for what happened in 2013 to 15. If you recall that Clean Energy Future package, there were two big licks of money put to one side, one to look after pensioners and people who are on allowances to meet their energy costs. The other was for the retraining of workers. And Katharine has just pointed out that had that been embarked upon almost a decade or so ago now, we would be in a much stronger position for the transition, which is absolutely inevitable, but people would be actually looking to secure employment both through and after that transition. So I think we're just looking back on a mini tragedy, well, actually a maxi tragedy, and that is what I lament about, I must say.
We're nearly getting ready to wrap up. I can see we've still got up over 800 people on the line with us. Thank you so much for joining us today. I did just want to throw back to you, Pete, and see if there was anything from these last couple of slides that we can get up that you want to talk about, or do we want to wrap up?
Look, we don't even need to go up, but one of the key metrics for change of elections is the country heading in the right direction or the wrong direction. At this moment, we've got 40% in the right direction, 40% in the wrong direction, and 20% don't know. So game on, people. And before we go, I just want to wish John all the best. John, it's the last time John will be with us for a few months. He's going off to support his partner with their first child. So thank you for all your work, John, and all the best from all of us at Pole Position.
Thanks, Peter.
Congratulations. That's very exciting news. You'll be sorely missed.
I'll have to make it up as I go along a lot more than I currently do.
Oh my God, the facts have left the building. What will we do?
I did just want to thank everyone for all your questions as usual. They were fantastic and I didn't get to all of them. So I do apologise. They're always fantastic. Don't forget to head on over to Guardian Australia, where you'll be able to find the podcast of the audio of today's webinar. You'll be able to find Katharine's write-up of the essential poll results, as well as Pete's column there. If you head on over to AustraliaInstitute.tv, we'll put up the recording of today's webinar. You should be able to access that. And also you'll be able to find details of the webinar with Saul Griffith on Thursday at 2 p.m. and also the Senate lecture coming up about what's going to be happening in the Senate going forward. So lots to see there, and hopefully we'll see you again very shortly. Thanks again so much for joining us. We really do enjoy these deep dives into what the public thinks, more so than what we hear about sometimes in the news. I think it's always really valuable, and we really appreciate all your fantastic questions and your engagement on the chat. It's really fantastic, and we're looking forward to certainly what is shaping up to be an incredibly interesting election year. Thanks again, everyone. Stay safe out there, and we will see you next time. Bye-bye.